Welcome, dear listeners, to the inaugural episode of Faith in the Dice. New Faith, New Media's new podcast about the intersection of faith and gaming. I am Wesley Morrison-Sloat. You probably know me as one of the founding members of NFNM, as well as the producer and editor of A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater. This show is my pet project and baby, but I didn't want to take it on as the host, like Gail did with Faith and What Resonates, or like St. Sparklebear is doing with Breaking Fast. Rather, I wanted to do a panel-style show, where a core group of 3 equals would play all sorts of games together, with extra guests as the various spirits move us. And then we would discuss the games, and those discussions would become the episodes that you would get to hear. I specifically wanted to make sure that the panel included a woman, as both religion and gaming tend to be very misogynistic communities, and I felt it was very important that we be conscious in representing women in our conversations in order to help push back against this unhealthy trend. The first person I recruited to help me with this project was my dear friend from undergrad, Kyrie Payton, and she became the 4th UNL alum to become a part of NFNM. Second, I reached out to quite a few of my friends and classmates from Star King School for the Ministry, and through the inimitable Noach Desmura, I was put in contact with James Perrin of Pacific School of Religion, who became the 3rd panelist. However, as the great American comic Alan Saunders, quoted by John Lennon, wrote, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." Kyrie told us that unfortunately she will not be able to be a permanent member of the panel. So for the first season, our 3rd panelist is rotating. Kyrie is brilliant and brings her unique perspective and sparkling wit to this first episode, and in the next episode, Reverend Michelle Byerly will be sharing her thoughts on Vampire the Masquerade and on role-playing in general. There are a few other changes between what was recorded here and what has since come to pass, but that's how the game is played, so we beg your patience. Thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy. So, James, I think this is the first time I've ever actually heard your voice.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's the first time I've heard yours, too.
Yeah. Well, have you listened to any of the podcast episodes posted in?
I keep intending to, and then instead spending the time on the dissertation, and then, yeah. So I haven't yet. I definitely intend to.
Okay.
I repeatedly intend to, but it hasn't happened.
Spending time on which page?
Oh, I end up spending time on the dissertation instead.
Oh! So you're once again working on your homework instead of goofing off on the internet. So irresponsible.
Yes. Yeah. Right now, I'm in that really mind-numbing phase where I'm going through every citation to make sure that it's correct, and all the entries on the bibliography, and making sure they match, and making sure that there isn't anything in one that isn't in the other. And
I was doing my MDiv at Star King, and then I got sick and had to go on disability, so I've never even done a thesis. I had to do...
You know what's weird?
What?
So I've never done a thesis either, because the specific program that I was in for my MA was the MA in Biblical Languages, which is really biblical studies with all the electives automatically in the languages. And so that particular program, because it involves so many language credits, they said, well, it's hard enough, no thesis required.
Oh,
and so I went into this PhD program not having done a thesis, and now I'm doing a dissertation.
Now, Kyrie, if you've ever actually finished a first draft of a novel, you automatically get the most impressive.
Yeah, no, sorry. ADHD kind of took that away from me.
Mm-hmm.
I know that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So I had meant to write a script of some sort of intro for this, but then forgot about that. So I guess, welcome everyone to Faith in the Dice. This is our new podcast or show, not quite sure what format we'll settle on quite yet, about the intersection of faith and religion with gaming. And we're talking all sorts of games here, everything from video and computer games to tabletop role-playing to board games to party games. So, and we'll cover everything. The only format decisions we've made so far is that we will have a core panel of 3, which will consist of myself, Wesley Morrison-Sloat, James Perrin, and Kyrie Payton. So, we're going to start off by giving some quick introductions of ourselves, just based on the order in on my screen, going left to right. Kyrie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Give me a sec here. So, I was basically born to be a nerd. My dad worked with computers pretty much my entire life, so I had access to computers and the internet and video game systems pretty early. My mom was my DM, so I grew up playing D&D. That she started me out, I think, at age 2 with a familiar. I would play somebody else's familiar.
Oh, that's so cool.
And as I grew older and able to do more, moved to regular characters. So I really love gaming of all kind, like board games, card games, video games. I have a growing collection of retro video games. I still kind of like having something physical, you know? So I like when I get a game from for like the Switch or PlayStation. Yeah, I do sometimes get something if I want to play instantly, but I prefer to go out and get an actual physical copy. So, and then religion-wise, I wasn't really ever pressured into a religion. My mom grew up Christian, but kind of explored on her own, and my dad was never particularly religious at all. So I was introduced to a bunch of old religions, but I wasn't really told, hey, you have to believe this or this is the truth. I was kind of let to come with my own conclusions. But I've always, even though didn't have any pressure put on me in that regard, I was always really fascinated with religion. I really like the ideas of why people form religions, what the common themes are, things like that. And so myself, I fall under the umbrella term of pagan, but I'm not Wiccan, although I've studied Wicca. I'm not any of the named paths. And that's me.
Okay, sorry, James and I both are chewing at the moment.
I am less chewing than you, it seems. So, okay, so I'm James Perrin, and I was also raised in a nerd family. On my mother's side, it's, long line of everybody being nerdy and loving things like learning and being smart and shit. And various kinds of games, the type has varied from person to person or generation to generation. But, it was a family that loved strategy or gaming or whatever and being nerdy. So that part was awesome. It was very much a science fiction type of especially Star Trek and stuff, household. Well, I'm speaking in a very choppy fashion right now. Okay, so that was going on. The thing was, though, I got really, and especially with the strategy games, the problem was that at some teenage-ish time, I got too good at them. Not like everything, but especially the one that was sort of my brother and I's favorite game, Starfleet Battles. And so it was just sort of this thing where it was like I would always win, which was really not cool to my brother, right? And so, over time, I ended up developing this weird attitude, that a lot of people don't seem to have, I think, of genuinely not giving a shit who wins or whatever, and instead just wanting to try a completely new strategy that I've never done before, just to see how it goes. And so that's sort of my approach to those things. But religiously, I was raised in a Lutheran family and loved it, and was headed for the Lutheran ministry and was being sort of groomed for it. I don't mean that in a negative or manipulative sense. I mean that I kept walking towards these walls and people would open doors in them and I would walk through.
Don't mean to interrupt. So, ELCA or Missouri Synod?
ELCA.
Okay.
Yeah. And then actually for early elementary school, went to a Missouri Synod, religious school, and I experienced them as being very emotionally abusive and, sort of an evil kind of a thing. But the rest of the Lutherans were rad, right? I was headed for that. And then in undergrad, ended up sort of rejecting that perceived call and became a denominational refugee. And while doing that, and thought, what I really want to do is teach, especially maybe at a seminary, that ministers are my people, but congregants kind of aren't. And so, So I started heading for the academic thing. While I was doing an MA, I met the dude that I'm married to now. He was getting his MDiv at Star King to be a UU minister. And so, I decided not to be a minister, so I married one, but, whatever. And then, and so then that's how I met the UUs and really fell in love. And now I'm totally in with the UUs, and that's great. I guess one of the things that'll come out over time, is that I'm sort of the epistemological nihilist, but also a mystic and a very post-Jungian kind of a person, heavily informed by academic biblical studies and things like that. Right now I'm doing a PhD in mythological studies and loving that. Sorry, I guess that was too long. Here you go.
Well, our conversations up to this point, before we started recording, we've had the running jokes of you get away with a lot because you're working on a dissertation, and also the running joke of stop doing homework and hang out with us on the internet. So, So, okay, I'm Wesley Morrison-Sloat. I am also a UU, which is Unitarian Universalist. I don't know how many people who are listening at this point don't know that, but enough people in the world don't know that I feel it needs to be said. I guess I am the veteran, as much as any of us, podcaster, in that I am one of the board members of New Faith New Media, which is the overarching organization that we are, as a network, a part of. I and 3 of my friends started that network: a United Methodist minister, an old Catholic priest, and another UU layperson. The Methodist and the old Catholic have one podcast together on the network. The other UU layperson has a podcast, and I was just doing network stuff and editorial work, producer work, and then I decided that I wanted to start a gaming podcast, and I recruited these 2. So, my bio: I grew up United Methodist. My parents were both United Methodist ministers and both nerdy in their own way. My dad, traditional sci-fi board game nerd. He loves Risk, loves chess. Every time my dad and I are together, we play a game of chess. And my dad brought Star Trek and Star Wars into the house, although my mom is also a huge Trek fan. My mom, on the other hand, is a theater and musical nerd. So, like, the charades and improv games. Grew up playing board games. I also liked the strategy ones more. Anything where everything came down to luck really bothered me, even as a little kid. I hated Candyland, or the Game of Life, where it was just dependent on the roll of the dice, or the flick of the spinner, or whatever. My parents were pastors in small-town South Dakota, and then small-town Nebraska, when the Satanic Panic, I hate that phrase, so hard to say, hit in the 80s and 90s. So even though my dad had always wanted to play tabletop role-playing games like D&D, and then I, as a kid, thought they sounded really cool and wanted to play them, my parents figured we really couldn't risk getting into them because their paycheck, and we lived in parsonages, so literally the roof over our heads, depended on not pissing people off. And everyone at the time that we were involved with at the time was convinced that any dice with any number of sides other than 6 meant you were dealing directly with the devil.
As though 6-sided dice are any better.
Right. Yeah. And also, being clergy family, money was always super tight. So, like, we got an original NES used 3 years after the Super NES came out. And then I got a PS1 2 years after the PS2 came out. I was always playing the awesome high-end games 5 years after they came out. Now I play everything I can get my hands on. So I've got this awesome game system now that I justified spending my entire stimulus check on because I'm using it as the central computer workhorse for New Faith New Media. Most of the audio and video editing of all the podcasts is getting done on this computer. But it also means that I can play games like Control and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun. Religiously, I converted to UU in college. I identify my specific philosophy as stoic, absurdist, existentialist, mystic, humanist. Basically, prepare for everything, make your own meaning, interact directly with the divine, but also that humans are ultimately responsible for their own decisions.
I forgot to mention what games I like now. Are you still sharing? Sorry.
No, go for it, James.
Okay, so in undergrad, I joined a role-playing game group. They were doing Vampire the Masquerade from the old World of Darkness, and I fell like head over heels in love with it. And it was perfect for me in 1,000 ways, that game specifically, and the rest of the World of Darkness generally. And so now I really kind of shy away from most strategy type games, except for Magic, I guess. Just because the dynamic of, I love the way that role-playing games are about collaborative storytelling and about things that happening that are interesting and that provide greater depth of character, rather than things that are strictly good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because if something shitty happens to your character, that's really interesting and makes for good cinema, so it's good. And if something, right? Yeah. So that's one of the things. I just forgot to mention that. So.
Sorry.
Games.
Go, Kyrie.
No, I just said I forgot to mention theater at all. My dad loved the theater, and I didn't even consider it. Yes, there are a lot of theater games. I didn't really consider it the same genre, but it absolutely is.
So about half of the people currently involved in New Faith, New Media across the 2 currently being published and 2 future published shows are University of Nebraska-Lincoln alum. Myself, Kyrie, Michelle Byerly, Gail Gallagher, all attended University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Kyrie and I met through the LFSF, Lincoln Fantasy and Science Fiction, which is how I got my start into role-playing games, and fell absolutely in love.
I think it takes more skill and more critical thinking to do something cooperatively than competitively. The cooperative games always involve a lot more aspects, in my opinion, and are a lot more fun.
Right. I absolutely agree. And there's also that, there's the stereotype of role-playing games being nerdy, being havens for nerdy, socially awkward people. But I think a big part of that is because they are established, safe places to experiment with how you interact with people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because like the whole point of a role-playing game is that you're going to get into situations that you aren't going to encounter on a day-to-day basis. I hope you're not walking down the street with goblins jumping out at you on a day-to-day basis. If you are, please seek professional help. I don't know if that would be a psych doctor to adjust your meds or an exorcist, but somebody who's higher qualified than me to help you out. So, like, for a person who isn't used to talking to strangers or whatever, then it's like, well, sure, come on in. Of course you're going to feel uncomfortable and make mistakes. That's the whole point. We're all going to do that. We're all screwy here. We're all mad here.
Yeah.
And the phrase that I've seen coming up a lot this past week, to tie it back into faith, is that in a perfect world, church is where we go to learn how to be human. Whatever your faith, whatever your religion, your place of worship is where you go to learn to be your best self. So if gaming provides that role as well, of course it makes sense that they fit together that way.
I hadn't really considered that.
Right, yeah. I love it. That's great.
Do you want to go to the...
started to read...
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just bouncing off of that. I had read the abstract at one point of some study, psychological study, that was basically arguing that role-playing games constitute, I think it's like edge play or something like that, which I thought sounded like it was a kinky thing, but it turns out what it meant was that because it was a simulated dangerous situation, that ends up having character development benefits, basically. That normally humans develop self-confidence through doing risky things. You know what I mean? That if you keep doing risky stuff, then you develop this feeling like you can do shit. And so basically the RPGs I think this one was specifically using D&D, involved these life or death situations, except not really. And so it still ended up building people's confidence anyway.
So it's like, I've called fiction ethical laboratories. So role-playing games could be called ethical gymnasiums.
Your characters, no matter what game you're
Yeah.
playing, are going to be a lot braver than you are.
Yes, by necessity. Like, if I were going to play a role-playing character version of myself, sitting down and filling up a legal pad with pro and cons would be a really boring game for everybody playing with me.
Simultaneously, if you are witnessing somebody being attacked by goblins, you aren't likely to jump in.
Well, I honestly might. I just would be unlikely to be very effective. I'm not meaning to talk myself up. It's just I honestly might.
Yeah,
Braver
it's just
than
the
I am.
truth. It doesn't have to be kind of bad.
So I think, I'm not sure, Kiri, I think you were alluding to this. We did all each prepare 2 discussion questions to try and keep the conversation rolling.
Yeah, that was absolutely what I was going to head to if it kept being silent.
Okay. I think one here that I think we touched on the general subject a few times. Kyrie, your first question, if you would.
Sure. So my question is, in a game such as Fable, where different moral paths have different endings, do you ever play an evil character?
Well, and I guess I'll riff first. I don't know if this is the accepted phrase or not, but I describe myself often as having a completionist fetish. If I start a book and absolutely hate it, I find the act of setting the book down and walking away more objectionable than finishing the terrible book. And honestly, that's something I've been working on with my therapist for 4 years. And I have gotten better. But, so, like, with Fable specifically, I played through how I wanted to the first time, and then went back and played through trying to be a paragon, and then went back again and tried to play through as a renegade. And renegade was actually really uncomfortable, yes.
If you're dealing with computery, or like console type, those sorts of role-playing games with different endings, such as Fable or the BioWare games in the Dragon Age or Mass Effect universe, I usually first time playthrough thinking about what I, sort of what I would do actually, and so I make decisions according to James's logics, or I sort of pick a particular ethical or convictional orientation and then try to play that. And then we'll often go back and try to... So what that ends up being, because I tend to be diplomatic, that ends up looking like the good guy, usually. Like the forces of good, generally speaking. Because I'm like, hey, why burn bridges when you can, develop contacts or something like that? And so most games don't know the difference between that and being kind, I guess.
Right. Like that,
and so
pragmatic...
and then
in the real world, pragmatic is different than ethical, but in games, it's often the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes. But then when I go through, I'll be like, okay, so that ended up mostly being the good choices. So I'll go through and try to be evil. And I end up dropping that pretty kind of quickly. Because the game usually doesn't know the difference between, undiplomatic and rude versus being evil. And so when I see the conversation option show up, and it'll be like, do you say, yeah, I'll think about that, or do you say, die, I hate you? Then I'll be like, well, I'm going to say the first one, even if what I'm thinking is die and hate, I hate you. And so I find myself having a difficult time choosing the evil SOB options.
So I find it so interesting. It seems like we're going on a gradient here. I never play the evil character, and it's because the few times that I actually tried, I found out that I was stopped having fun. It was so uncomfortable, I wasn't having fun anymore, so I stopped playing. So when I play, I always go with what I would do. What I would do is usually what they consider the good option.
That's absolutely understandable. But I think also the thing is, nuance and writing have improved to some extent, but also technology has improved to the point where more moral subtlety is possible.
Hell yeah.
Let's see, how long have we been recording? 25 minutes. First Minecraft reference.
Wow.
Whenever I play Minecraft, one of my first things I try to do is make a chicken farm, because a really quick source of food, experience for enchanting, feathers for making arrows, all sorts of stuff, and because of eggs, you don't have to spend resources to breed chickens. You can just collect eggs and throw them, and I forget what the ratio is, but a certain number of every eggs you throw will hatch into chicks that you just wait to grow up into chickens. But then the thing is that after a while, you have a really overcrowded chicken farm. In-game, there's no consequences for this. They're at least not yet. I trust that eventually Mojang will decide.
Well, there is actually a crowding feature. If you have too many mobs in the same spot, they will start dying.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. But anyway, even before that, I would just feel uncomfortable with it. I would just decide, okay, there's too many chickens, I'm gonna go in and cull, even though I don't need more meat, I don't need more experience, whatever. Especially if I had built an automatic egg harvester throwing system so that there would always be an increase in chicken population. I would just, like, once a day go in there and kill half the chickens, because I thought it was unethical to just let the population density increase. And it was absolutely the conditions in my little Minecraft chicken would make PETA head explode. But I don't know. And it's the back and forth. Sometimes in a very simplistic story like Fable, I can enjoy playing the Renegade because it's so over the top, it's basically satirical. But when there's that moral complexity, then it makes me uncomfortable.
For me, the other distinction is that with interpersonal role-playing games, when you're playing with other people and you're doing the collaborative storytelling thing, in those settings, a lot of times, one of my favorite things about it is that it allows you to portray a really rigorous philosophical and ethical path that is not aligned with the standard things that we might associate with good.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I love about the World of Darkness, particularly Vampire, is that it really hammers this home, that you can have a person practicing this rigorous spiritual discipline that looks to us very evil, right? And so in those sorts of games, and especially since it's with people instead of with a computer, I can really get a lot out of picking someone who does have a consistent ethic and is following it, but where the nuances of that ethic are actually not good exactly. Or sometimes are in fact directly evil, but where the person thinks they're doing a very good job of it or whatever. I get a lot out of that depth and that kind of nuance. A lot.
Well, and that leads me into a question that I specifically wrote down here to ask you, James, while you were talking about your bio. When you said Starfleet Battles, I've never played that game, but could you play as the Klingons or the Romulans or the Borg? And if so, how did you feel playing those enemy races? Or sometimes enemy races?
Yeah. Okay. So this game was started in the 70s. And this company got the rights to make a board game out of Star Trek, before the show ever aired. Okay. And so, but that's what they have the rights to, is this stuff, how it was going to be before anything even started. And so it is different from a little bit different, but it's based on the original Gene Roddenberry stuff. And so what it is it's a board game, that can be either done with little counters or, they even made models, so that you can have figurines on a hexagonal board, and you're maneuvering your spaceships, and you're diverting the power from this system to that system, and doing those sorts of things, and having a space battle. And so they totally included basically all the races that people would think of to include, and then several others as well, and they have a big galactic history, and it's really fascinating. It's kind of an overly complicated game for what it wanted to be. They they wanted to make it so that you could do everything, and the problem is that, well, I mean, it's great that you can do everything because it adds tactical complexity, but it's also irritating because that means that things can take longer than they really should, because you have to worry about like, hey, are we powering the transporters right now or are we not, or whatever. And so absolutely you can play Klingons, which in that universe, because it was before anything started, instead of being, spiritual, ninja warriors, they're just about brutality and enslaving people. They're like, hey, honor equals winning, basically. That if I can beat you up, then I have more than you. And so, they just go around enslaving everyone. However, this is one tiny thing. So they didn't have the rights to publish stuff that took place in like Next Generation or later. However, there was this one dude who was at MIT who just had the ultimate nerdgasm, right? And made a site with full rules for everything ever published, that had to do with Star Trek, including he actually figured out how to make the Borg work. And the company said that he either needed to add their logo to every page of the stuff on his webpage or he had to take it down. And he was like, dude, that's like 70,000 pages, so I'm just going to take it down.
Oh, no.
But anyway, one could use the Wayback Machine, theoretically, hypothetically, to get his stuff anyway and use it. So yes, playing the Borg is possible. I haven't gotten the chance to, though.
But I mean,
that was more than you wanted to know.
Close enough. But that goes into like the.
Oh, sorry. To answer the real question, you were asking about how I would feel about playing the so-called evil races or whatever. That game is so entirely based on tactics and strategy and such that things like ethical quandaries or whatever don't really come into it. Not in that particular game. So in that you're just flying a Klingon ship because you want to be the Klingons right now.
Okay. Which is fun sometimes.
It sounds like a fun game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But like that was talking about moral nuance, like every enemy race that has ever been in Star Trek has at some point also been an ally, even if just because of circumstance. Like the big enemies in original series were the Klingons and the Romulans, and
now they have been redeemed
or explored to the point where it's like, oh, you don't really need to be redeemed, you're just different.
True, yeah.
The Borg were the big baddies. The Borg and the Ferengi. The Ferengi were an attempted big baddie, and then they were just too ridiculous to be used. And the Borg were the big baddies in Next Generation, and then the Ferengi became one of the, I guess, side character races of Deep Space Nine, and the Borg were alternately antagonists and allies in Voyager. The Cardassians went from antagonists to side characters to antagonists again to allies in Deep Space Nine. It's basically the whole point of Star Trek has been, listen, it's more complicated than that.
It really is. All of these sentient races are in fact sentient and therefore not inherently good or evil.
Right. But they do, but one point that I loved that they made on Deep Space Nine is certain individuals can be straight up evil, i.e. Gul Dukat and Kai Wynn.
I wouldn't call Gul Dukat straight up evil, but I get your
I thought that
point.
was the whole point of that episode, and we've veered off into Star Trek, which Andrew Miller, the old Catholic priest, will love, but that whole episode where Gul Dukat and Captain Sisko are trapped in the cave, and Gul Dukat is hallucinating, I thought the whole point of that was, yep, this dude is straight up evil.
Oh, I guess that's right. But yeah, up until that, he did have redeeming qualities that made me just love the crap out of him. And then I was really kind of heartbroken or annoyed with that episode because it actually removed the nuance from the character, I thought. And I was like, damn it.
Yeah, but I thought that was interesting because everything that he said fit so perfectly with everything that he had said and done before. It wasn't that his character took a sharp left turn to become an evil sociopath. It was just that he let his evil sociopathy off the leash. He just stopped caring. I need to rewatch that. He just stopped caring about hiding it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, Okay, so, Kyrie, I guess you talked briefly about how uncomfortable it made you to try and, like, do a Renegade run-through, but,
Yeah.
was there anything more you wanted to say on that line?
Oh well, we briefly touched on vampire, and the interesting thing about vampire is that due to the fact that all of you require blood to survive, none of you can be truly good.
Well, but
Yeah.
who here reads questionable content by Jeff Jacques?
Oh yeah, I love that comic.
But there's
I haven't heard of it.
a line in one of the comics where and they live in a post-singularity world. There's sapient AIs who have been granted full citizenship and human rights, although they now call them sapient rights under the government. But one of the main characters, he's at one point says, "Until we figure out that whole post-scarcity thing, we're all complicit in something."
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And
Well,
I
go
don't,
ahead.
and I believe that. I believe that that means we all need to cut each other some slack, and we all need to explore the interconnected complicity of our systems. However, I don't believe that means people should get away with shit. When somebody actively
Right.
does something bad, bring the hammer down.
For me, the point with that, I haven't seen the comic, right? But with the quote that you just had, with regard to like going easy on ourselves or whatever, for me, that understanding of things, that until we figure out the scarcity bit, then we're all complicit in something. That is my favorite and sort of one of the only ones that I can go along with myself, right? Reinterpretations of the whole concept of original sin. Is that even when I'm doing awesome shit, right? Chances are I'm also still contributing and benefiting from lots of systemic oppressions. It's like driving to a climate rally,
Right.
or like, right? Or, or like being at a BLM protest in clothing that was probably made in a sweatshop.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck, right? That's sort of my favorite reinterpretation of that.
Right.
What I would say is it's kind of falling in line with you can't fill another person's cup if your own is empty.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take care of yourself first before you can go out and fix anything that's wrong with the world. You have to make sure you are in the shape to go fix things in the world.
Yes, and I think that
By
is
being complicit.
I think that's something that we can tie back to gaming, especially in a lot of the strategy gaming and exploring gaming, that you can't go out and tackle the big baddies until you have established your resource base. So, sorry, this is the one that I know the best, that I know the one that I know of Kyrie at least can comment on. Minecraft, you can't go save the village and protect it from raiders and zombies and whatnot until you have the resources to make yourself armor and weapons and build a wall around the village. But you can also be ethical in how you get those resources. You don't have to clear cut the forest. You don't have to steal everything and burn down one village to save the
Oh my
next
gosh,
village.
this is reminding me of something. So I don't know if either of you watched the Hermitcraft series on YouTube.
No.
The Hermitcrafter Mumbo Jumbo this season is doing everything as ethically as he can. He's replanting all of the trees. He's not killing a single mob. He's getting all of his resources either through other people or through chests or by replanting. And I think that's really interesting.
That would be fun. And for listeners, future episodes do include us playing and talking specifically about Minecraft, and also getting James running a World of Darkness one-shot with all 6 other New Faith, New Media people as the party. But since he's working on a dissertation, we haven't slammed down a time on either of those things yet. And I think this actually leads into a good segue into, James, your first question that you wrote ahead of time.
How does the concept or act of winning or losing in a strategy game relate to your theology or ethics or the like?
Could you elaborate on that? Have an example?
We have our worldviews about the nature of reality and about ethics and morals and things like that, and the kind of world that we want to build and the way that we think things do work. And we also have strategy games where the goal is to win by defeating your opponent. What is the relationship between this practice of winning by defeating your opponent, and your theological or moral or cosmological or ethical convictions? How do they go together, or do they not, or whatever? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I'll dive in here. Like one of the things you said, for instance, going back to your bio, that after a while you got quote unquote so good at strategy games that you stopped caring about winning. So like the like Starfleet battles, you, instead of like, how can I beat my brother as fast as possible, it became I want to try this specific strategy and see how I can make it work. And I've definitely found myself doing similar things. Like, I started this game recently from that I got on the Epic Games store called Frostpunk, and it's a steampunk setting. The idea is that some environmental cataclysm that I haven't gotten far enough in the game to get a full explanation for has caused a new ice age to hit the world in the Victorian era, right at the height of the Industrial Revolution. So the player is in charge of a group of settlers who are, for some godforsaken reason, heading north from London. I don't know why why the world is freezing over and they're heading north. I don't know. And they build themselves as a civilization survival game. So it's not a traditional city builder. It seems like one when you first start. So when I play a city builder, my whole thing is I will start it over again and again and again until I figure out the optimal first few days to make the rest of the run-through easy. So, like, every time somebody dies within the first few days of a city builder, I'll start it over. And I still find myself doing that with Frostpunk, but the whole point of Frostpunk is you are doing whatever you have to keep humanity alive. People are going to die. People are freezing to death, people are getting frostbite, and you're cutting off their limbs so that they will stay alive and functional enough so that they can at least stir the pot of stew and contribute a little bit to survival and keep the human species alive. And so it's just this completely redefining how I normally think about winning in this kind of game.
So, winning or losing, especially in a strategy game, I think, is never actually the point of a game to me. The point of the game, in a strategy game in particular, is to broaden your horizons, learn something, get better. And so if you are enjoying the game or learning something, it doesn't even matter if you lose, in my opinion, you've still won. It helps that I've always been not particularly good at games, even though I like them. I have had to learn not to be a sore loser pretty fast.
That's comparable to where I ended up when growing up. It's not that I would have like a specific known strategy that I would aim for. It's that I would be like, okay, what's the dumbest thing I can do, and how do I turn it into an awesome thing? Like I would just try to invent strategies that were like straight up stupid, right? But that no one would ever think of doing, because they're too dumb, and then trying to do that as well as I could.
I've done that with this game, a card game called Keyforge. I really think you'd enjoy it, especially if you like Magic. This game called Keyforge, I got really good at it, which was surprising for me. And so if I'm playing against a new player, what I'll do is basically just this: what's the dumbest thing I could possibly do, and can I still make it work?
So it's like, can I make a Leroy Jenkins work?
Exactly.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So, like, as an example with Risk, right? One of my favorites that I started doing at one point was, I thought, I had figured out how to do these various standard things, of like, there's the North America molasses wall that wins every time, and then there's the Australia thing that everyone hates, and whatever, right? And then I was like, well, what if I just did this, like, took the, like, as an orcish horde, and just didn't even care about territory, but was like always like attacking a meandering path going forward, that just like goes through and busts through everybody's walls and doesn't do anything else. And so I was effectively living off of cashing in cards only, right? And as it turned out, it was surprisingly effective, right? I mean, I didn't have a prayer of winning, right? But I was in this four-player game, and the result was that everyone was spending so much of their time trying to repair the damage that my horde had done when it crashed through their walls or whatever. You know, like I would go crash through, they would spend some time repairing, and then all that, and they would bicker with each other too some. I never actually had to worry about running out of territory. I would always have at least like one little territory left, right? And then I could go on my big wall, from there. And it was actually really entertaining.
Right.
But, yeah, anyway.
Well, and like tying that into real life history, do you know, I'm sure, James, they've come up based on your field of study, but the Sea Peoples at the end of the Bronze Age, the collapse of the Bronze Age, these people who were technological...
Yeah, the Philistines.
Oh, I never put that together. That would make sense. Anyway, so it's these group of people that nobody's exactly sure where they came from. As far as I know, current historical theory is a bunch of nomadic groups from the western end of the Mediterranean Sea. All this environmental crap, earthquakes and crop failures and fungal blights and shit, hit all around the Mediterranean Sea. The Bronze Age civilizations on the eastern end of the sea were moderately more able to handle them, but the nomadic people on the western end of the sea were capable of moving. So they all got together, formed a loose alliance, and started attacking the people on the east. And they couldn't actually conquer, but the people on the east were so tenderized by all the crap that had been happening that they didn't need to conquer them. They just needed to cause enough chaos that they could move into the spots that had already been abandoned because of the stuff that had been happening. Then these civilizations, basically all of the civilizations there, except for Egypt, collapse, and when they rebuild into the Iron Age, they just incorporate the Sea Peoples, into the new civilizations.
I hadn't heard that level of detail on the historical end. I mean, that's kind of cool. I had just heard that, there's the Hebrew word Philistine, right, which is a transliteration of the Greek thalassos, which means sea. So yeah, the Sea People. So basically, the group that in the Hebrew scriptures is called, the Philistines are basically Greeks playing Pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah, or Greeks playing Viking Raider, I guess. Yeah. So for me, like with the question about the ethics thing, for me, the dynamic of winning and losing feels too much like enforcing a scarcity mindset, that there's only like so much joy or whatever to go around, and so you have to make sure the other person doesn't get any so that you can have some.
Yes.
Or whatever. You know what I mean? It's too much about like violence. It feels like violence. Right?
I agree.
Like that the way that I'm going to have fun is by hurting you, right? And so I find it unfun.
I like that. I've never heard it put quite that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me. That if you're constructing your fun around the idea that only some of the people in the activity can have fun, then something is really messed up.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well,
so yeah, that's why I had to.
No, I was just going to say, I think, didn't chess masters used to teach new players by intentionally losing over and over again?
Well,
I have no idea.
I don't know. My dad and I came up with this game at one point that we call suicide chess, which is that we take that rule from checkers that if you can take a piece, you must, and apply it to chess, and then you play trying to force the other person to checkmate you. It's hilarious and impossible.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
So step 1, uncover your king, and then steps 2 through 6 are move it one space forward.
Right.
Okay.
It's so hard.
That could be entertaining.
And so ridiculous.
That's fun.
Anyway. But also, like Kyrie, you were talking about the Hermitcraft. Is that the channel?
Oh, yeah?
of trying to play as ethically as possible. That one of the reason that I've kept coming back to Minecraft over and over again. I mean, I'll often take like a 5 or 6 month break, but I keep coming back since I started playing sophomore year of college, so like 2009, is that you can play it however you want. You basically define your own winning conditions.
Mm-hmm.
The only agreed upon way to win is to get all of the achievements, and so few people actually do it that way.
No, nobody wants to go and get all the achievements. I mean, there's another way of defining it as defeating the end dragon, but there are so many resources you don't have access to unless you've defeated the end dragon.
Right. It's silly.
Really, the point of the game by itself is just to have fun with the game, and I think that's ought to be the point for every game, but that's different.
Right. Right. And the fact that Mojang is like, well, we make enough money from this game to live comfortably and to continue to have fun coming up with new updates and new side products like Minecraft Earth and whatnot. And so we're just going to keep coming up with interesting updates and taking care of our community.
and not charging with every release. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. They to me feel like they have a very similar energy to Enya in her castle in Ireland with all her cats. Just like, I don't care what the rest of the world defines as success. This is what we have defined as success, and we're going for it.
That's fine.
All right, next question. Oh, kind of want to ask this one. This is one of mine. Has playing any character in a game made you so uncomfortable that you just had to stop?
Yep.
You answered so swiftly, Kyrie, that I just have to hear this story.
Oh, yeah. No, I actually did this twice in the same game. So I was in a LARP for Vampire, and the character that I started with basically made a mistake and got one of the people that I cared about most really upset with her. You know, we were outside of character, we were fine. All right, it was only in character. But it got to be, I felt so horrible as this character that I asked the storyteller to end my character. Let's start over fresh, all right? And so in doing that, I came up with a completely different character. This completely different character with a new personality came in and was instantly hated, rather than, you know, that sort of cautious, oh, we don't really trust you. It was like, no, instantly everybody doesn't like you. And I was like, this is worse. I'd rather go back and just apologize. And so, it really made me really uncomfortable because of the social aspect of it, really. Not having people, even though you can have a separation of people and their characters, it is difficult to do that because when you are that character, you are that character. Mm-hmm. And so having that level of discomfort really makes it difficult.
What about, like, not LARP or tabletop role-playing? What about, like, in a video game?
Well, I mentioned in the previous one, I did try at one point to get a different ending in Fable, mm-hmm. and then I just ended up stopping because I didn't like playing evil.
Okay. And what about you, James?
Oh, okay. So, yes, but it wasn't because so this was also in a vampire group. There are some friends of mine that run sanguinus.org, which is a 24/7 internet relay chat server of a vampire game that they've been running it for like 15 years, right? And they're really skilled at managing the whole crowd and everything. And so there was this, when things switched over to 5th Ed Vampire, you know, everyone really wanted to emphasize the, like, no one can play a good person, you know, you're definitely already pretty evil and everything. And so I made this character that had certain character flaws. He was so resentful and spiteful and was so miserable in particular ways that going and playing that, even though I was doing a good job of it and stuff like that, I hated getting into that mental space of being such a resentful and spiteful person. And so even though I was in the process of sort of succeeding in certain ways, I intentionally went into a situation where I knew that chances are I would get, you know, like murdered or whatever in a public and gross way. And it turns out I really was. And, even in that, there was sort of that thing where it's like the person is sort of offering the choice of like, all you have to do is admit that you're wrong, and we'll let you live or whatever. And so because I was so miserable portraying this dude, I had him do something against character for once and not, apologize or whatever. So because I wanted him to be done, and I didn't want him to move away to a different city. I wanted the character to get executed, right? Because that way there was no chance that I would be asked to play this dude again. It wasn't his evilness; it was just the toxicity of his emotional life that I disenjoyed so much.
Yeah.
That reminds me a little bit of when I tried to run a LARP. I had to come up with antagonists, right? And so don't always find somebody to play the antagonist, so I played the antagonist myself. It was so difficult, all right? I had a good reason, a good backstory for this villain, but the instant some other character could reason it out of me, I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't so much that I was uncomfortable as much as they logicked it out. Okay, it doesn't make sense anymore.
And that I could see that being more uncomfortable. Having the system of logic of a character clash with your own system of logic be more uncomfortable than the system of morality of a character being more clashing with your own system of logic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go, James.
Part of what we're getting at is this concept in social psychology of high monitors and low monitors. This is something that I remember from an undergrad course. So big caveat, it's entirely possible that like all of my details and info are incorrect. Basically, for the most part, you can end up dividing people into sort of two groups. I haven't seen the data on how pure the division is, right? But, this is the idea. And so there's the low monitor folks who, if they were to, let's say, portray, like a Nazi in some play or whatever, and you said, wow, you did a really great job, then the low monitor people and stuff would be like, oh shit, that means I'm terrible. Like what does that say about me if I'm playing a Nazi well? And then there's the high monitor people who would be like, wait, I did a great job of it? Yes. That would think, hooray, I did a good job of portraying this, rather than, oh no, that means I'm a terrible person. Which isn't to say that either one of them is better. It's just sort of, it's interesting that people tend to gravitate towards one of those mindsets or the other.
Well, and I think that segues nicely into me talking about my experience with having to abandon playing a character, which actually Kyrie was in this game. It was GM'd by her brother. And there were a lot of factors that led into this. One was that Kyrie was the only person in the group that I knew. The other was that it was all text-based. So I was having a really hard time reading and projecting the social signals to understand this stuff of, are these people mad at me? Or are they mad at my character? And the other stuff was having a really hard time coming to terms with my own social needs and advocating for them. I was playing an absolute asshole. My character was a survivalist, half-elf, half-something, half-halfling. And we were in this setting that I'm not going to go into, but basically we lived underground and there was one city. And it was supported by this creepy magic technology stuff, and I, being raised by my survivalist mother, was convinced that this technology was going to fail, and anybody dependent on the technology was going to die when it did. So I, guided by my own morality, believed that the most ethical thing to do was to prepare for the failure so that I could save as many people as possible. So the very first session, I walk into this convenience store where we're all supposed to meet up. Cops walk in, looking for the lady who's our contact, and somebody else in the party manages to talk the cops into leaving. I walk up to the cop and shoot him in the head. The rest of the campaign, my character is dealing with this fallout. I'm also doing things like trying to talk the rest of the party into starting a drug ring to fund our efforts. The DM, Kyrie's brother, is constantly assuring me that all of this stuff is really interesting, really fun. He's great, he's really into it. But then all these other little comments, like, oh, I wish you hadn't done that, are just getting in my skin. And ultimately, I have this huge anxiety attack. I call my best friend, Michelle, who's one of the other New Faith, New Media hosts. She has to talk to me for like an hour. And I send a letter to Kyrie's brother asking to leave the campaign. Another person from the campaign messages me and we have this talk, and she basically says, oh, I didn't realize you were neurodivergent. I'm sorry, we would have dealt with you differently. And I sit there and go, oh, I have severe depression that when it's really bad manifests as hallucinations. Does that count as neurodivergent? Well, why wouldn't it?
I didn't know about half of this, honestly. I knew what was happening in character, and I knew that you, Wesley, were not having a great time, but I couldn't figure out how to get it resolved. My brother told me that he was talking to you and he was making assurances, but it didn't give me any details. So I just want to assure you my character was mad at you, but I was not mad at you.
Right. And this is real. That experience has greatly affected how I've approached New Faith, New Media. And I've talked with my therapist about it a lot. But it's one of the things that's come from gaming, that's come into my theological experience. And moving forward, because I do want to finish my MDiv and become an ordained Unitarian Universalist ministry, is that while neurodivergent people might be the only people who come out and say it, even neurotypical people appreciate having the rules written down and told to them. So, like, as we're moving forward with New Faith, New Media, we're trying to be very conscious of what the rules are. And not, like, having way too many rules, not like going full Roman Catholic, but having clear rules.
Nobody was ever hurt by clarity.
That's a great... I'm writing that down. One of the things I fell in love with when I walked into Lincoln Unitarian Church in college was the 7 principles and 6 sources. As opposed to the Bible, this huge book written over thousands of years, half of it's oral tradition that's been translated 6 times, half of it's poetry, another half of it, even though that somehow adds up to 3 halves, this genealogy. The UUs have 7 principles and 6 sources, and we'll debate it to death, but it all comes down to 7 principles and 6 sources. And hopefully in a year, an 8th principle. But yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm done.
No, you're writing down.
Okay. So we've all asked one question. Oh, this is a fun one. I'll ask my second question now, which is actually my first question. Have you ever come up with a character you'd love to play, but have never had just the right game for them?
Well, I have. I have a character that I really enjoy that was created with changeling setting, but honestly, any game that this character would fit with, I'd really like to play it. It is a puka named Biscuit, a raccoon puka, and Biscuit follows I don't know if they've changed the rules in Changeling. I think they changed it so that pukas have to always tell the truth, but it used to be they always have to lie or use a willpower to tell the truth. Biscuit never tells the truth exactly. Biscuit's never factual. Biscuit's never factual, but always tells the truth. And so getting around that rule, anything that you hear from Biscuit, you can't take literally, but you can probably take Biscuit at Biscuit's word. I haven't come across a game where it really fits. Even when I made it with the Changeling rules, the Changeling game didn't last. It was the one session where we introduced ourselves, and that was it.
Oh, sad.
Yeah.
And I've never gotten to play a World of Darkness game, so I'm really looking forward to playing James one shot. And I know everybody I've met who's named James answers this question differently. So James, how do you prefer the possessive form of your name? James or James's?
I prefer James's.
Okay.
I'm okay with seeing it written as James, but pronunciation-wise, to me, I feel like it should obviously be pronounced James's.
Okay. And I feel that the owner of the name gets final say. So, James, what is James's character that you would love to play and have never gotten a chance?
So weirdly enough, except when I'm GMing and then thus playing like, a bajillion characters, right? I've never actually had the opportunity to play in Vampire, in the World of Darkness, a follower of one of the paths of enlightenment. And so, yes, I have a bajillion. Almost all of them are path followers.
What is a path of enlightenment?
Okay, so basically the idea is that, and part of the big central theme, with vampires that, okay, like Kyrie was saying, you have to drink blood, and it basically pretty much has to be from humans, right? So morally, you're screwed, right? You have this constant thirst, right? You keep trying to be ethical about it, but eventually you're going to accidentally drink too much from someone, right? And they're going to get sick or die or whatever. And you're going to feel really, really bad about that, right? It's going to kill your conscience for a while. But you still have eternity left, right? So it's going to happen again at some point, no matter how careful you are. Okay, so fast forward, it's now happened 28 times, right? Chances are you don't feel anything anymore. And so that moral slide never stops, right? You're doomed, right? If you think about eternity, right? Eventually you're just going to be a blood monster, running around like a fast zombie. That the thirst and hunger are so strong, and the fact that a morality based on not harming people is fundamentally incompatible with your nature. So most of them are in this difficult spot of trying to navigate that, trying to hold on to their humanity as long as they can, while also being in a situation that makes things like trust impossible, because they're all doing the like social manipulation thing around each other and stuff. Except for there's this one sect that sort of says, well, hey, the problem is that you're trying to make a morality system and practice it based on not hurting people. And so really what you got to do, if you want to hold on to your psyche and yourself, right, and your sanity in the face of all this, is to intentionally create a monstrous spirituality and ethic to practice, and practice it really rigorously. And then you can do that and stay sane for potentially eternity. And so that's what these paths of enlightenment are. They're totally inhuman. And basically the difference is that if you sort of think about the humanity morality slide, it's based on don't do this. It's a whole lot of don't do kind of rules, you could sort of say. And so the problem is that eventually you're gonna do it. So instead, what you gotta do is you gotta make a morality system based on always do this. And so what these paths of enlightenment look like are things that are completely reconciled, totally okay with the fact that you have to, eat other people basically just to make it through the day. And so there will be ones that are like always experiment on your own body and the bodies of others, right? Constantly to try to learn more and more and more about the spirituality of physicality. Do this and so you get this like Dr. Mengele kind of a thing, right? That is kidnapping people and turning them into test subjects, but doing that to themselves too, and always trying to evolve in this sense.
Like
totally
what was that minion from the first Hellboy movie? The guy with surgery addiction who had the clockwork heart.
I've forgotten that. Oh, cool. Yeah. Okay. So based on what you said, something like that. Yeah. Or if you think about some of the post-humanist movements right now, where they're always trying to increase their cyberneticness, by like sewing magnets into the pads of their fingertips, right? Doing things like that. If you imagine always doing this to yourself, yeah, that kind of a thing. And they have a bunch of others, like one based on the idea of, okay, this is a state of damnation, and we're so religious that we're going to then do God's will, which is to be as much a creature of damnation as possible.
Oh, gosh.
As damned as possible, right. And so their whole job is to go around and be the biggest challenge to everyone else's morality that they possibly can. Both through being just outright terrifying and through, doing things like corrupting a religious organization or whatever. Because if they do that, religiously, then that helps them hold on to a sense of who they are. And in a sense, one of their big goals that they would never admit that they have is actually to be defeated by a person of faith.
Interesting.
Right? Because that's when you have really done it.
That is,
right?
Would be, I mean, from what I said earlier about it being an ethical laboratory, an ethical gymnasium. That fits right in.
Yeah. I completely adore this aspect of Vampire. It's the coolest.
That would be one where what I know about myself now, I would never feel comfortable doing in a pure text function. I would need to be able to see and hear the people I'm playing with. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, and it's basically like it gets misunderstood as I'm just going to go and kill everyone. You know, these paths sometimes do. But really, seriously, it's kind of like the thing of saying, well, everybody else is destined to slowly descend into a blood monster. But it's not like I'm Hitler. I'm just Jack the Ripper. That's all.
And you've watched Babylon 5, right?
Hell yeah.
So you know the episode with the Inquisitor from the Vorlons, who turns out to be Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
So
yeah, totally. The other one was basically in a D&D game that was like a path follower. I tend to, even in D&D, I tend to create characters that are, like I said, that are following some totally weird morality path. And so one of them was that they were setting it in like this idea that in 2012, the Mayan thing sort of happened, but it just sort of shut down all technology and reawakened magic, right? And so now they're, somewhat Shadowrun, but, post-tech, right? And so I was like, oh, well, based on this, and this from, Mayan stuff, then my dude is going to think that its job is to corrupt the universe so far that it collapses and a new one starts, because what happened was the apocalypse failed.
Interesting.
And so the humane thing to do, the kind thing to do to everyone and everything is to help end the universe so that it can be reborn. And the way you do that is through blood sacrifice.
Sounds sort of like one of my no longer socialist, ultra radical socialist friends, socialist yet somehow libertarian friends, who believed that the best thing for the liberal movement in America was for Trump to win another 4 years, so that society would collapse and we would have a true communist revolution.
Yeah, that's 100% libertarian. That's not socialist. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I unfriended him. He came to
Yep.
Second Unitarian of Omaha a couple times. I developed a massive crush on him. Also found out later that he was convicted of a sexual assault. So anyway, moving on. So the character that I would really like to play would be a drow drider who so like the waist down giant spider. And but completely, and that the whole thing is that they're typically transformed into driders as a punishment for failing a test to Lolth, their deity of chaos, who's not just chaos in the let's make mischief like Loki, but chaos like let's destroy everything. So, but that they this character being completely dedicated to non-lethal combat. So, being a giant spider has the spinnerets, has a practically infinite supply of webbing. James, all right, James. That's too good to just be a text comment. You have to say that out loud.
Oh, I said that the character obviously drives an 8-wheeled car, Night Drider.
But and I think to make this work would have to be cross-classed up the wazoo. But like uses nets, uses lassos, uses blowpipes with darts that have like paralytic and tranquilizers with all sorts of different mixtures for different races, and acts as a bounty hunter who always brings in their bounty alive. That would be the character that I would want to play. And that the reason that they got punished by being made into a drider was that they rejected the drow are superior and we must eventually conquer the world and kill all other races ideology. But like James, I'm almost always playing DM, not player. So, Kyrie and James, both of you have a question left. Who wants to go next?
1, 2, 3, not it.
Okay. So my remaining question is, what game or world of a game would you choose to live in if you could, and why would you choose that one?
We've actually talked about this quite a bit leading up to this recording session.
Yeah.
But
And I found...
we talked about like...
I was just going to say the answer seemed to be different depending on whether or not you were the player character or not.
right.
And that's really interesting too.
Yeah, most the ones that are interesting are usually horrifying, is one of the things that we were talking about. And so, like, all of my favorite gaming worlds would, if I was just a regular human, or if I was even like a player character type of a thing, would be awful. It would just completely suck to be a member. Yeah, it would have to be something like, I mean, if you were just like some average human or whatever, or being in Star Trek in the Federation, that could be fun, because then you'd be like, yay, no poverty, space socialism.
Babylon 5 after the fall, after the end of the Shadow War, after the fall of President Clark. I was like, Minecraft could work, because the whole point of Minecraft is anybody who does the work can do anything. The villagers don't, but that seems to be because they make choices. They live in their village and pursue their trade. The wandering nomads choose to wander between villages, between player outposts. The witches...
And we have learned from the pillagers, which are apparently the same species, the pillagers are violent, so that is also a choice.
Right. So Minecraft is a gorgeous, expansive world, but also it's been established by things that the creators have said and things we've found in the games, that it is post some huge cataclysm.
Okay. Yeah.
But the one that I keep coming back to is Pokemon, because they've built this society around, we need challenge, we need adventure, here's a way to get it, that provides stimulation, provides purpose, is not contrived. It's not like the Hunger Games, where it's, here's something to point you at so that you don't rebel against the horrible government. It's a legitimate thing. But also, you can settle down and have a good life. I know that they're not called Team Rocket after the first game, but the various teams Rocket are legitimate threats, which means that there's enough freedom for people to have different ideas, but these legitimate threats are always defeated, which means that there's enough civil infrastructure that society is not going to be toppled. It seems like a pretty good utopic society to me to live in. And the music's pretty slapping.
Thanks.
Kyrie?
Oh, is it me? Okay. I think, based off the same logic that you chose Pokemon, I would want to choose Azure Dreams, which is this largely unheard of, yet still very difficult to find, PlayStation 1 game, wherein it's kind of like an older society. It's not modern day, but you still have some modern benefits due to magic. So like they have this booster bike that you can use. If you have enough money, you can buy a booster bike, and that'll make you go really fast. And that's kind of modern, but it's not really. It seems like they have indoor plumbing, which is a big plus if you're going to be playing a game. But all of the danger in Azure Dreams is something you can choose. It's something you choose to do, and you can. So, because there's the tower that the city of Monsbea is based around that you go into to fight monsters, get money, find treasures, get resources, and it's completely optional. You don't have to do that. There's plenty of other careers in the town itself, and that's all of the conflict. There's no war. There's no real villain. I mean, aside from the villain within the tower, but again, optional. And I just think that that's probably ideal.
But like, back to what James said about the really good moving games are the ones where there's something so horribly wrong. Like, is it canon at this point that Half-Life and Portal are in the same universe?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what isn't wrong in that universe? But like the technology that they pulled this genie out of this bottle that is not going back in. In Half-Life, or I mean in Portal, it's the only person in the game in the universe seems to be the test subject that Gladys, and then what's the one who takes over from Gladys briefly in the second game, is torturing. And it's like, yes, it's a wonderful game. But if you were living in that universe, you would be the test subject. It would be terrible. Maybe we talked about this too much before we started the panel. So, James, we're to you.
Okay. So, what's the relationship between your faithy stuff, broadly construed, and the way that you play or the way that you GM role-playing games? So, for example, like the gameplay dynamics between players, or the way the storytelling is done, or, the big whatever.
Well, I definitely have an answer for this, but...
Yeah, I'm not going first. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess this is a huge influence for me and the way I GM. So my current game that I'm playing, I'm not currently GMing because my Tuesday game that I play, my cousin JT and I alternate. And he is currently running. This fall, he's going to start his freshman year at University of Nebraska, Omaha, and when that happens, we're switching and I'm taking back over. But my campaign is called When Gods Clash. And I've briefly described this campaign to you guys before, but the basic setting, we're using D&D 5th ed because there's just so many resources. But the idea is that there's this world that in the far past was an intersection of interplanetary, interworld trade. And then this massive war between the worlds broke out. There were 4 aggressors, shifting alliances and crap, that raged for centuries, and all of these refugees from destroyed and devastated worlds ended up on this world. And then all of the non-combatant gods got together and cast this huge working and brought the 4 combatants together and said, listen, knock it off, this is too devastating. And years of negotiations, and ultimately decided the only solution was to figure out how they could have a quote-unquote safe combat. So this planet got designated the combat zone, and they formed a compact of rules about how the combat could proceed. And the god of this world got put in charge of basically being the referee. So it went from being a war between gods fought between worlds to being a war between gods fought on one world that happened to be full of the refugees from that war before. And the whole thing I wanted to be, because it's being played by me, a friend from my church, Second Unitarian Church of Omaha, a friend from my therapy group that I was in when I first moved to Omaha, my dad, who's a Methodist pastor, and my cousin JT, was raised evangelical Christian, and this fall is going to be joined by Cassandra, another friend from Second Unitarian Church. So, I wanted to be exploring the idea of, what do you do when your God is straight up wrong? So, the joke of, if God descended from heaven and told me to pronounce it GIF, I would flip the bird and walk backwards into hell. But only about actual important stuff.
How about you, Carrier?
This is a difficult question for me because while on one level I try to keep faith separate from the rest of my life because I feel like it's a very personal thing. I don't want to impose it on anybody, On another level, faith has to be a part of everything in my life. Coming out and thinking of, okay, what ways have these actually intersected is a difficult question. So I think the biggest one is when you go into a D&D world, there's the immediate acceptance that there are all sorts of gods. And if you go into the D&D world, there's the immediate acceptance that each one of these gods is valid, is real in the sense of that they can be real. And so you have to come across people with religions that are different than yours, even in game, and be able to work with them even if they believe something completely different than you. I think that really intersects pretty well with the way that I work in Faith.
For me, one of the ways that it shows up is that, for example, I hinted at the epistemological nihilism, so the really intense perception that genuine knowledge or objective knowledge isn't possible because there are always layers of hermeneutics, the act of interpreting between us and whatever it is that is being interpreted, which can be a text or a person or an event or, like a coffee cup. And so one of the ways that this shows up for me, in the games that I'm GMing in particular, is that I am very careful never to tell or even hint to the players how to interpret anything. And what I mean is that, I'll describe the actions that someone takes and might describe their body language and facial expressions, but I'm never going to tell the players that this person is or is not lying, or things like that, right? Or what the significance or meaning of an event is, or what was really going on behind it either. That for me, because, the combination of context and the, ever-presence of hermeneutics and shit, instead I create these really rich and complex settings with lots and lots of characters that all have their own complex motivations and their own designs and plans and, things like that. I'm always really careful to avoid interpreting any of it to the players. And so that's one of the things that shows up a lot. And actually even different understandings in what events mean or even are, or things like that. Those show up in the non-player characters that I've created that, they won't have the same understanding as each other. I also avoid directly providing motivation because I think that the motive is motivation is something that is so important and is arrived at through so many interconnecting things that I don't give that to the players. Like a lot of times stuff you'll see, especially if something is recorded or whatever, like it'll start with the GM being like, okay, you've all arrived at this village and decided to help out in killing the dragon or something like that.
And for me, that's not good storytelling.
Right.
Or like they'll give the background on the new village that they're just venturing into, and I'm like, no, you got to find that shit out the hard way.
Right.
And so instead, and especially for information, for me, information is really hard to come by, and there are always layers of interpretation and layers of lies and manipulations all around it. And so instead of just telling the characters something, giving the players information, they'll have to discover it. But I also have to know how, whatever their source was, how they got what they got and where they got it from, right? And so it's never just like a character, some NPC telling the characters like, oh yes, there's a dragon up in that castle or something. Instead, it's got to be this thing where they uncover it through sifting through webs of lies and shit. And so just because that's kind of how I see the whole universe and the way of everything being. Yeah, and I guess the other thing that frequently shows up, that it just constantly shows up in the games that I'm running, and in my perceptions a lot of times of TV shows, is that there will always be people who took actions in the past and in the present, and people who will take actions in the future because of what they anticipate the results are going to be. And some of them might be correct and some of them might be totally wrong. That actually it's going to have a very different effect. And that there are often other characters who are doing things because they're anticipating other characters anticipating, right? And so for me, that is really important, especially in GM games, is that there's some characters have wheels within wheels going on for their plans, and others just have like the one wheel by itself, and other stuff, right? And they all intersect each other. And so I'll set up that giant framework of a world and let the players then try to navigate that in all of its complexity. And so there's always this dynamic of them, sort of being fish out of water, but also having a big impact on the plot. But also other people were predicting them having that effect, but other people were not. And, like these things, and there's stuff going on that they don't understand. And it makes for a game that isn't just complex, but I think is much more riveting for people.
Right.
And makes it so that they're really motivated to learn shit and to take actions and to blah, blah, blah. And so that's sort of how these things
So I've seen this joke post a couple times of somebody talking about, like, they described a scene in an alley. There's this gang of goblins over to the side around a burning barrel trying to keep warm, and they're describing the scene, laying it all out, trying to guide them toward going and talking to the gang, and they just half-heartedly throw out that there's a cat over to the side, just as scene building. And they go over
and then they all immediately talk to the cat.
Right, and like, and it sounds like what you're saying is you would build the cat in so that if they go to talk to the cat, fine.
There is a healthy place for improvisation and stuff like that and thinking on my feet. It's true that I try to do that as much as possible, but then I know that I'm not going to think to plan every cat. But what I do is that if I've created a rich enough and complex enough world and plots and events and things like that, then flowing with it when players do something that I didn't anticipate, right, and building that into stuff and making it cool, right, is very easy and flows pretty naturally.
Right. So like if I need them to talk to this kid who hangs out on the wharfs right when they get into town, and they make some decisions and end up going in the wrong way. Well, then there just happens to be another kid who this time is hanging out on the steps of the public library. And all of my notes that I wrote for the kid hanging out on the wharf work.
Every once in a while I'll do that, but for the most part, it's that I try to make settings and courses of events that will be just fine with the players all fucking off and not talking to the kid on the wharf. So that, they can go and intersect with it or not. And either way, the world will go on. And, they might like what happens or they might not. And they might figure out why things occurred or they might not. Because, if they had gone the other direction and found the kid in the playground, that would be entirely different.
All right.
That's what I aim for.
That makes sense.
But the weird thing, this is not on topic of the question, but one of as soon as I had really GM'd my first vampire, it was intended to be a one-shot, but it took like 3 sessions. As soon as I had done that, it changed the way that I saw stories and narratives forever, and has made it so that now I can just predict the shit out of anything that I'm watching, any TV show or movie. And it has everything to do with the fact that I'm aware that it's not actually possible for the storyteller to put something in there that doesn't matter, right? That basically anything that shows up is there intentionally, right? Even if it's an unconscious intention, right? Like on some level, it was on purpose. And so something will happen and I'll be like, that's going to come back to haunt them and it's going to do this and this. And then the plot is going to turn out to be blah, blah, right. And it's like 15 minutes in, and people will be like, that's stupid. That no, this is clearly going to go in this other direction. And then it'll turn out that I'm, magically right or whatever.
Because when you're building a scene, you don't put that cat in unless the cat's important.
When I'm initially planning the scene, yeah. Just the awareness, that everything has that I can't possibly say something by accident. Right? Especially when writing the material, beforehand, it's not like I can accidentally decide that all of the cars are going to be red in this one town, right? If I say that, of course it's significant, right? That, and the players are going to be like, why the hell are all the cars red? And so if I see something like that on a TV show or whatever, then boom, okay, that's important.
So it's either consciously a Chekhov's gun or consciously a red herring.
Yeah, or unconsciously one of the others, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Trying to say was the conscious, that it's always conscious, but I include the unconscious thing, and so it just makes it so that that in the mythological studies background makes it so that I end up identifying what story is being retold.
Archetypes.
And myths, like which myth is being retold. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because when I first started going to classes at the university for mythology, otherwise I was just, studying on my own. I would know all the myths. I wouldn't know the context or reasoning, But when I first started attending classes, I realized there are details in these myths that you don't think are important that are actually important. Like if you talk about the Persephone myth, why did she eat pomegranate seeds? Why is that part of the story? Well, it's actually because pomegranate's an aphrodisiac.
Or an abortifacient.
Yeah, both of those.
Or a what?
Abortifacient.
An abortifacient? They would also use pomegranate juice as an anti-fertility
yes.
for women.
There were various other ingredients as well. I think one of the flowers that she was picking did the same thing. They mentioned the flower by name. and I don't remember what it was, but that did the same thing. It was common in ancient Greece because they married so young. You didn't want to have children immediately because that was dangerous to the mother. That was something that they'd put in the wedding cake.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one thing I think is riffing on that, the heart shape, traditional heart for love shape, there are so many reasons people claim that that's used. There's one that I've heard that's like the somewhat wholesome reason is that that's the shape that dragonflies that make when they're mating. It's often called a dragonfly mating wheel. But the dragonflies that lived in the Mediterranean, the dragonflies and damselflies that live in the Mediterranean don't do that. That's a North American dragonfly, damselfly thing. The more common, probably more realistic one, is that there was a plant that was used as a birth control in ancient Greece and Rome, that the seed pods that were the ingredient used for that was shaped like that. And it was in such high demand that it's now extinct. They fucked it into extinction.
Dude, the Hebrew stories, Hebrew scriptures and stuff are full of the opposite sort of thing that I really adore. This is the biblical studies thing talking, that they will omit all of the most important details. And so when you start to realize that, then you realize that, oh wait, I've been assuming that the details were filled this way, right?
Uh-huh.
But I mean, these stories trip you up and force you to reveal your hand, because you assume that obviously this is in the text, but it totally is not. And that you actually could have filled in those gaps very differently and ended up with a completely different story. And so there are like 28,000 stories per story. So like, here's an easy example, right? Or two easy ones. Abraham with Isaac taking him, up to the mountain for the sacrifice thing. All of the most important things are not told. And it's those gaps that make it really fun to like mess around with and possible to get really deep shit out of. Or if you go with the Cain and Abel story, right? It says, talking about Cain, and he went to his brother in the field and he said to him, and he killed him. Well, wait a minute. What did he say to him? Right? Because that can make for an entirely different story.
Did he just come up to him and say, and he killed him? And Abel turned to him and say, what?
Right. Or they could have had some argument, or he could have said, hey, look, I have to do this. And Abel might have said, okay, I understand. Or I mean, like all kinds of shit, right? There's, yeah. But it leaves it out entirely.
Oh, I wanted to go back to Kyrie, what you said about not consciously putting your faith into a game, but at the same time, if you're a person of faith, your faith
is a part of everything that you do.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's actually part of what inspired us to make the New Faith, New Media network, is that modern life, people talk so much about modern life being devoid of faith, but actually modern life is suffused with faith. And the only people who seem to be talking about it loudly are the evangelical assholes. And I'm sorry, I swear a lot.
No, that's fine.
Why I wanted to do this is that when I game, it is a faithful activity. It is an act of faith. Thank you, guys. This has been episode 1 of Faith in the Dice, New Faith, New Media's podcast about faith and gaming. Thank you all for tuning in for this admittedly long episode. We really appreciate it. If you enjoy what you heard, check out our sister podcast, Breaking Fast with Saint Sparklebear, where Saint Sparklebear has one-on-one conversations with guests and discusses faith and food. And check out NFNM's other 2 shows, A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater, and Faith and What Resonates, both of which air on Wednesdays. If you really like what we do, please join the online discussion at our Facebook group at www.facebook.com/groups/NFNM group, and consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/NFNM at the $2, $5, or $10 a month level. Thanks again, and have a good game.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you next time.